All right, trust no one. This is why you must fact check every guest statement made on your podcast. Fact checking is an essential component of producing any nonfiction podcast. And that's what I'm here to talk about today. Hi, I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and I help creatives and business people in the podcasting industry cover their legal bases and protect themselves and the things that they create. And this is Legit Podcast Pro, a short weekly show where I offer you legal tips and information and strategies that can answer your questions so you can grow your podcast like a pro. So here we go. Okay, so twice this week alone, I have had this conversation, or one like it, with podcasters who found themselves in the crosshairs of accusations or threats or complaints of one sort or another. So I thought I would share some best practices and recommendations with you. So the scenarios I'm talking about are, one of them, here's one, a call with a producer of a show who interviews people who have been through traumatic experiences and things like that. And one of the guests came on the show and didn't name names or whatever, but she was talking about her former spouse and talking about the fact that she had been in a toxic relationship. So, of course, out comes the podcast episode, and the ex-husband reaches out to the producer and had some issues. It wasn't fully fleshed out what the issues were, but we were in a position of needing to sort of head this off at the pass. So this is very much the scenario that can lead to something like what we saw on a grand scale, the battle between Johnny Depp and Amber Heard over whether or not she defamed him when she referred to having been a poster child for domestic abuse or something like that. That kind of a statement, even though you don't name names, can be a problem. In another one of the scenarios, it's a producer who was talking about doing a show that actually calls out bad experiences that people have had with certain specialist professional service providers, professional service businesses in this particular industry that she wants to talk about. And we were looking at, well, what do you have to do in order to make sure that when you're calling these people out by name saying, hey, so-and-so's program did not do what it promised, or so-and-so did XYZ in the program. So that is another kind of a scenario. And the truth is, this could come up in any scenario, even if you just do a light comedy talk kind of show, or maybe even just a solo show where you just talk about whatever's going on in your mind that day or whatever. All it takes is for you to have one factual error, and you could really tick somebody off. You could cause harm or damage to their reputation. Lots and lots of things that could go awry with that. All it takes is that one little error, and you could find yourself like these folks did in the crosshairs or concerned about being in the crosshairs. So let's just run down some of the kinds of issues that you might need to address in a case like this. First off, are you getting into privacy territory? There are sort of flavors of privacy. Are you, intrusion, invasion of privacy is where you're sort of entering into a person's bubble of private space, and that bubble varies depending on what they're doing and when they're doing it and where they're doing it and those kinds of things. But that's not likely to come up for podcasters, except if you're recording somebody without their knowledge and consent, or if you put microphones and cameras into someone's house surreptitiously or something like that. And that's why we use releases to get the consent. Excuse me. But there's also publication of false light invasion of privacy, where you set up someone you create a false impression about them that's not strictly speaking a false statement, but it nevertheless presents them in a false light. The one I worry about is one of the ones I worry about is the public disclosure of private facts. Private embarrassing facts is sometimes how it's articulated. And in those situations, you're revealing something that is true about a person, but that they have kept private, and that should be, or at least in the eyes of the public, should be kept private. Things like medical information, prescriptions they take, syndromes they have. Educational records are in this category of private information. Healthcare records are private information. Employment-related records are private. And so if you were revealing stuff that should really be kept private within a particular setting, then you could get into some issues there as well. And then the last form of privacy violation could be a misappropriation of someone's name or likeness, but that's only going to show up in a commercial purposes kind of a use. And most podcasts aren't what we would call a commercial purpose in that regard. Even though you may be making a profit, that doesn't necessarily make it commercial. So that's the privacy component. The next issue that we worry about, and this is probably the bigger one, is that case for defamation. Defamation, which comes in two varieties. One is slander. That's the spoken word, where one person is talking to another person or a small group of people without the aid of electronic media or large crowds or those kinds of things. That's slander. Libel is the same thing, a form of defamation, but it occurs in the context of a broader publication using technology, social media, online, radio, television, video, podcasts, all these things. That's going to look like libel in the eyes of the law. So the law is a statement is libelous or slanderous if it is false, made of or concerning a particular person, false statement published about or of or concerning a particular purpose that causes harm or damage to their reputation and therefore damages. So a false, damaging statement made public without proper consent or reason. So the issue of truth and falsity is sometimes a little touchy one. And when you're talking to people who are expressing their point of view about something or what happened to them, and they say something about either someone who did something to them or someone who was nearby, and somehow if that's harmful to that person's reputation. For example, survivor of domestic abuse. Well, if they know you were married and who you were married to, you just made a statement about the person that you were married to. Now, you may have considered it domestic abuse, but if there was no legal finding of domestic abuse, then that person would be justified in saying, hey, no. Saying something's a toxic relationship, that's more like an opinion statement. And opinions are protected under the law, under the First Amendment, free speech. You're entitled to have your opinion, share it, and those kinds of things. But as soon as you get into the factual statement kind of area, that's where we get into this problem. So what do you do as a podcaster? Well, as the title of this episode of Legit Podcast Pro says, you got to fact check. So I say every podcaster that gets into this area of if it's fiction, you've got other issues. But if you're creating a nonfiction thing and you're talking about real people, real events, you need to have some kind of a protocol in place for fact checking the material before it goes public. And that may mean just a second set of ears listening in after the fact to the recording, or maybe the host listening while you're making the recording and flagging things that are said. It may be a matter of reviewing a transcript after the fact, looking for anything that is a factual statement about a person who hasn't signed a release, someone other than the guest generally, and then you got to go verify those things. Either ask the guest, can you give me some verification? Was this proven in court? Is there other evidence of this? Was it reported in the newspaper? You want to corroborate these statements. 2 or 3 footnotes to corroborate these kinds of statements is really the best practice in this arena. So you've got this protocol in place, or you then edit out the statements that you can't back up with evidence. And unfortunately, that is the best practice for these scenarios. And the reason we talk about this is that even though it's the guest on the show who is making the statement, they're doing it on your podcast, your platform. And so in the law, there is this principle of what we call secondary or vicarious liability. And there are exceptions, and there are situations where, if you're doing journalism and you're reporting on the fact that so-and-so sued someone else for such and such, and here's what the statement in question is, then that the journalist is not responsible. The news media is not responsible for that. But when you're the host of a show and you interview somebody and they say something false and harmful about their ex or someone else, that can be something where you get held liable for the libel or slander as well. So, first off, fact checking. Then what happens if somebody does reach out to you and say, hey, you published something bogus? Well, I suggest informal handling of it first. Now, if you get a letter from a lawyer, then of course, yeah, you hire a lawyer, talk to a lawyer, and figure out your response from there. But if you just get, as the case with this one show, the husband reached out, the ex-husband reached out, and I suggested let's informally see if you can find out what it is that he's troubled by. Does he have evidence that the statement is false? Does he have some kind of proof? And don't make any commitment to do anything. Don't promise a retraction. Don't promise to take it down or edit it out. Don't promise anything until you've had a chance independently to essentially fact check after the fact. Look at that evidence and decide for yourself, what are you going to do about this? Now, you have to do this quickly. You can't just let it sit for weeks and weeks and weeks. But then if you do find that the statement was false or misleading or something, maybe you do a retraction. Or you edit the episode and you say so. We've edited the episode. There were some statements in here that are, that we aren't sure are true, and we don't want to mislead our audience. Those kinds of things. What about disclaimers? What about saying the statements that you hear on this show are the viewpoints and opinions of our audience, and they are sometimes colored by the unique perspective each person brings to the scenario. Will that help? Yeah, it can help. But if there's a false statement, even though it's someone else's false statement, you're responsible for making sure that it's not published if it's true, genuinely false. So that's that. Now, there's one other scenario that comes up with that you need some, I'll call it fact checking, but it's really vetting, right? And that is where the guest has promised someone else not to reveal information. For example, in the scenario with the show that's going to telling the truth about experiences with this particular service, some of the customers of these kinds of services may have signed confidentiality agreements, non-disclosure agreements. When you attend certain kinds of events, especially like coaching programs or courses and things like that, when you attend these events, there's very often a waiver that you sign as an attendee. And it looks like it's you can record this, you can use what I say, those kinds of things. But somewhere in there is usually buried a promise not to reveal what you learn inside, what you experience, not to talk out of turn. And that kind of confidentiality and non-disclosure language can be a bit troubling. Lots of event organizers use these things. Now, we can talk all day long about whether it's a good idea from a public policy standpoint to allow these kinds of non-disclosure agreements, especially when you're talking about activity that might rise to the level of criminal conduct or like sexual misconduct and things like that, because there are genuine public policy concerns that would disfavor enforcing these kinds of things. But it still has the power of a contract. If you are entering into a contract with somebody promising not to talk about them, and then you go on a podcast and talk about them, then you could be liable. Now, could the podcast host be liable for that breach? Probably not. At least not unless the host knew that the NDA existed and encouraged or induced or incited the person to say the things anyway. In that case, then there might be some basis for claims there. So I mentioned earlier the release. I'm a strong advocate that every podcaster who has guests should have those guests sign a release agreement that says, hey, I am giving you consent to record me. I'm giving you consent to use what I say on your podcast and to broadcast or distribute that in any way, shape, or form you like. And I promise not to sue you and so on. So why isn't that enough in this scenario? Well, the reason is that the person they're talking about is the third party, the ex-husband, the former boss, the trainer or whatever that they were dealing with in that situation. So it's great to have the guest sign a release. It's a lot of protection, but it only protects you so far. Now, another thing that I get asked a lot about this is, could an indemnification clause in that agreement help? An indemnification clause is just that I promise that what I say is true and that I hold you harmless against any damages, liability claims, and those kinds of things that might arise as a result of me not being correct about this. That's great. Indemnification clauses are very common and very powerful, but they are only as good as the financial backing, the financial ability of the person promising to indemnify. So if I promise that I will indemnify you for any damage that might happen, whatever it might be because of something I say to you or on your show, that's great until the $1 million claim comes along and I don't have $1 million to pay it. So they still are looking to you, or just to hire the lawyers to defend the case or whatever. So indemnity is nice, but it's not the end all be all. The right thing to do is do your fact checking, make sure and verify that what you're doing is accurate. And if you do get sued or if you do get claims, then definitely reach out to a lawyer. Don't make any statements or admissions. Don't try to solve it informally beyond asking a little bit for more information, but do not make any statements that could be used against you. And be thoughtful and careful. You need to bring a lawyer. If you're getting sued or threatened, you do need some help from a lawyer. So looks like we got some comments here from folks. Bashir says, hello, nice to see you, Bashir. Great to see you. Yeah. And Victoria says, hi, great session. Question, if you have a guest that's talking about an ex but uses an alias for him and says that she experiences verbal abuse but not physical abuse, does the inability to not identify the ex protect you? No. This is a great question. The thing is, if you're talking to a guest and that guest is identified and the ex, even though you don't mention the name or you refer to them as Bruce when their name is actually Charlie, if people know who the guest is and people who know who she was or he was married to, then we're still able to identify who that particular person is. The oven concerning the plaintiff is a really challenging issue because it's often possible to infer or identify even when you haven't named somebody. So you got to be really, really careful about this. Now, if the guest is also being identified by a fictitious name or whatever, and the unique characteristics of the guest's voice, or if they're on camera, their appearance, if they're more anonymous, then you might be able to get away with it, arguing, hey, nobody knows they're talking about you. But many plaintiffs have succeeded even when their name wasn't mentioned or their name was changed or something like that, because people did still figure it out. Another area that this comes up is when you essentially defame a group of people. That entire football team did XYZ. Well, first of all, it's unlikely that all of the members of the team are responsible for the same activities, but also any member of that team, if you look at who was on the varsity football team at this high school in 1969, you can find out. It's still ever concerning a particular person. And so that's another point to be concerned about. And so that's sort of the situation. Thank you for your question, Victoria. That's a great one. Let me just tell you a little bit that our show is brought to you, as always, by the Legit Podcast Pro community. It's a free group and entity, organization, where we help each other to grow and prosper and in our podcasting ventures. So please join now. Head on over to legitpodcastpro.com. Do I have a... I don't have it. Oh, it's on the screen. legitpodcastpro.com. And I appreciate your being here with me today. And that's going to be it. I'm done. I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and I will talk to you again in about a week. Have a great week. Bye.